here in 10 minutes.
Huh?
Maria said she'll be here in 10 minutes.
We're gonna start. Okay. All right. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. We're gonna start. Good morning.
Morning.
Morning. Welcome to this important event. I'm Carlos Teixeira, the director of the PhD program at the Institute of Design at Illinois Tech. I want to welcome the participants here in the room and those joining us online. Thank you for coming and joining us around the world. The Institute of Design started the first PhD in design in the United States 30 years ago, in 1994. Since then, ID has pioneered design research, practices, and education in design strategy, interaction design, and human-centered design, which are now common knowledge, professional practices, and curriculum adopted worldwide. Today, Azra will present the findings from her PhD research. As a tradition, PhD researchers are expected to share the original contribution they developed during their doctoral studies with society. It's a give back from all the support they received in their journey of developing new knowledge. Special thanks to Laura Forlano and Wesley Ashton for your mentorship to Azra. And Maria Villalobos for joining the advisory committee. Maria is just joining in a few minutes. I want to thank Fulbright in Turkey and Grace Colby, ID Emeritus Board Member, for their generous scholarships to support Azra during her years of research. Scholarships are fundamental for attracting and nurturing the best talent in the world to work in the biggest challenge of our time. Our future depends on them and their work. Speaking about our future, Azra will present her research findings today. Azra's contributions are timely when so much is at stake about our future. She will talk for about 45 minutes, and we will have at the end 10 minutes for questions and answers. Now I will give the time here for Wesley to introduce Azra and her research. Wesley is the primary advisor for Azra. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, folks online. So this is a very exciting time for us. Azra started her PhD during the pandemic, and this was a challenging time. And so we are so excited to see this conclusion of her work, which marks a first for the doctoral program at ID in the fact that her style of dissertation is one of 3 articles rather than the traditional monograph. So the work that she'll be presenting has actually been peer-reviewed and presented in design audiences locally, nationally, and internationally. So we're really excited about this. Let me just, say some nice remarks about Azra. So as Carlos mentioned, Azra came to us as a Fulbright scholar from Turkey, where she was previously working as a social entrepreneur. Her training is as a visual artist and designer, and she brings a wealth of creativity to the Institute of Design. And what her work is highlighting is how designers can play a role in shaping the infrastructures, the stories that we tell collectively to make sense of the futures that we desire. So her title, Cultivating Narrative Change in Collective Sensemaking, is meant to demonstrate how designers can develop tools and frameworks to change the stories of the futures that we want. Right? And so it's not just a compilation of like putting things together, but actually engaging in generative tensions between the ways that we view the world and make sense of the world, and can create space for new ways of knowing and being to really drive towards new futures. So Azra, I think we're all very excited to hear from you, and we look forward to your presentation in defense of your work. All right,
Thank
good luck.
you. President articulates my work so good every time, like, how am I gonna explain this better? Let's see. Hello, thank you for joining here today. Everyone in this room contributed to my journey in one way or another. Some inspired me, some of you guided me, some of you really supported me in the toughest time. So I really appreciate all your contributions that made this work possible. And I just want to highlight that my role in this work was also like gathering all of these pieces of wisdom and insight that I found through these connections. So it is a product of our collective wisdom that I got to synthesize. So it gives me great pleasure to share this moment with you. So I'm talking about stories and narratives. We're gonna play it a little bit unconventional here, and I'll start with a little poem. Where I live, many paths will lead you home. Another home, behind another door. A place where you're cared for, with a warm hug on a winter day, a slice of pizza, or a pair of socks if you need one. Or with beats to dance to on a sunny day, stomping the soil or working it with a fork, gathering what's left from the all-devouring reason of a world that plans otherwise. A place for misfits with no other planet to go to, fiercely tending to the one that we have. Stewards of impossible gardens, weavers of unseen nets, we sing the songs on silences of our kins across time. The gray skyline towers, unmoved, oblivious to its vanishing dream. Beneath its shadow is where I live, west of the lake, middle of west, where other worlds are quietly made. This work is an ode to those other worlds that are being made every day, all over Chicago, all over the world. These worlds, the possibilities of other futures, are the things that keep me going, and I want this work to be an ode to those possibilities. And it's also about how these possibilities are made invisible by the dominant narratives. The poem that I just shared was inspired by Humboldt Park. It's the neighborhood that I live. It's probably not the way a lot of people think about Humboldt Park. It's also sometimes not the way I think about Humboldt Park. But if you're to change the storyline of humanity, it's these stories that we need to tend to. So I'll talk about how design can play a role in this. This research, like many others, started from a deep frustration. Why is it so difficult to act collectively even when our shared futures depend on it? During this time that this work came to being, humanity passed multiple planetary boundaries in a period called the sixth mass extinction. Human lives were lost to war, to starvation, to pollution. It's a dark picture. It's also not like nobody's doing anything. In the past decades, societies have evolved an unprecedented capacity to collectively make sense of the complex social and ecological crisis we're tackling today and search for possible pathways together, experimenting with solutions and generating new approaches. This is enabled by new platforms, data infrastructures, governance models that foster the collective intelligence and sense-making capacity that we need to tackle these challenges. At the Institute of Design, we are familiar with the evolving world of design in this space. where designers are creating space of collective inquiry to facilitate the flow of knowledge and ideas beyond the boundaries of disciplines and organizations. This view of collective sense-making emphasizes the combination of perspectives and knowledge around a shared vision. But what we often don't account for is that stakeholders bring more than perspectives. We'll start with an example of United Nations Food Systems Summit. In 2021, UN Food Systems Summit brought together delegates from over 150 countries, presenting itself as a Peoples and Solutions Summit. This was a call for everyone to join forces to reshape how we produce and consume food. The summit platform hosted expert views, case studies, statistics, different mission framings. It was the ideal of collective intelligence that's being promoted nowadays. But it wasn't so unifying after all. Hundreds of organizations boycotted the event, protesting its corporate-centric approach. Instead, they advocated for food sovereignty, the right of people to define their own food systems, rooted in solidarity and environmental stewardship. So this is a completely different way of thinking about food, but also how we relate to each other and to the nature. The controversy is still going on since the 2023 summit faced a similar backlash. These kind of challenges and controversies are not unique to the food system. We see similar conflicts in various systemic challenges, from shaping the future of urban mobility to biodiversity conservation. At times, it seems like the only thing people can agree on is the fact that there is indeed a problem. This is because how we choose to tackle systemic issues shapes our long-term futures. What kind of economies we're building, what kind of world around the food we're shaping, how we're envisioning labor rights or human dignity. A helpful notion to understand this that grounds my research is socio-technical imaginaries. Believe me, I was very excited when I came across this concept. Imaginaries describe our collective visions of desirable futures that are formed through material, cultural, and institutional arrangements, and in return drive policy agendas as well as science and technology production. How stakeholders interpret the issue and which pathways they advocate for depends on their vision of good life, as well as where they experience the present from and the past they carry with themselves. This diversity is often seen as a barrier, a matter of clashing agendas and conflicting perspectives while we try to find a shared pathway forward. However, we argue that this diversity, if we do know how to navigate it, can be our greatest resource to push back against dominant paradigms that keep perpetrating extractive and oppressive practices and help us uncover the horizons beyond these dominant paradigms. This is the core premise of this work. We cannot tackle today's social and ecological crises with the same mindsets that contributed to them. The ethos of control, efficiency, optimization that drove post-industrial societies will only get us so far. The challenges that we're facing today require more than changes to policy and infrastructure. They demand a radical reimagining of our collective lives with each other and other species. So when the dominant imaginaries serve the interest of those in power and keep perpetuating the status quo, we need to engage with and amplify alternative imaginaries to foster radical shifts. Imaginaries are an inherent part of design practice, whether we are aware of it or not. They shape how we locate issues and what possibilities we account for. Equally, when we use design to make sense of issues, we are getting informed by design practice, and as we frame issues in specific ways and propose solutions forward, we are activating or at the same time muting certain imaginaries. When we're blind to this influence, we risk perpetuating the problematic dominant paradigms that are ingrained in our heads and marginalizing other possibilities that are in the making rather than amplifying them. In order to tackle this, I turn to a fundamental sense-making mechanism, narratives. So I use narratives to explore how design can intentionally engage with diverse imaginaries, other two words there, in collective sense-making. And I also explore how this engagement can cultivate more plural ways of shaping our collective futures, can cultivate criticality, and can foster creativity in our thinking. Imaginaries can feel like well-worn glasses, spectacles that we are wearing every day. We are so used to seeing through them that we even forget that they are there. But they keep shaping our perception. But imaginaries are also not just abstract, invisible forces. They're actively being performed as societies make sense of issues, generate knowledge, shape agendas of development of science and technology or policies. One way in which we can observe imaginaries is narratives. Narratives are a fundamental sense-making mechanism that we seem to forget from time to time when we see sense-making as a combinatorial view of combining knowledges. From ancient cave paintings to tweets or policy reports, humans give meaning to their lived or imagined experiences by telling stories. So from a narrative lens, collective sense-making is not a neutral process of capturing, codifying, and combining information. It's a distributed and networked practice of telling stories. As organizations and diverse collectives engage in systems change efforts, they capture stories and weave them into broader, more stable narratives of change. These narratives capture how they frame the issue, the alternatives they envision, and the pathways that they advocate for. You can think of things like vision statements, white papers, policy papers, but also things like street art, zines, placemaking that convey a certain vision of change. These narratives don't just represent reality, they actively construct it. They shape how people make sense of the world, how they envision common good, and what possibilities they deem viable. As future scholar Sway Nayatullah aptly put it almost 3 decades ago, the discourse we use to understand the issues is complicit in our framing of the issue. So if we go back to the UN Food Summit example, the dominant approaches to transforming food system are anchored in a narrative of scarcity, that we don't have enough resources, so we need to optimize our supply chains, our agriculture, how we work the soil to get the most out of it possible. When our vision is grounded in this mindset of scarcity, first, we cannot notice the abundance that's all around us, but also it becomes infinitely difficult to imagine a food system where people do actually control their own food instead of relying on a super smart and efficient hand of a multinational corporation to optimize it for them. As designers, by shaping the conditions of collective sense-making, we influence what stories can be told and what stories are left out. And this has direct consequences for how issues get framed and what possibilities can be envisioned in the sense-making process. So over the past decade, an extensive repertoire of tools and processes have matured in design practice, showing alternative ways to tell stories in ways that evoke emotions, connect people, that surface the underlying paradigms, or that help people align on shared perspectives. But in order to make an attempt at shifting narratives in a broader collective sense, we need to think beyond how design tells stories and understand how story systems are cultivated and sustained in the broader collective articulation of systems change. So the aim of this research is to understand how narratives can be leveraged as a sense-making mechanism to account for and engage with diverse imaginaries in design practice. And I explore how this might foster a more pluralistic, inclusive, and critical collective inquiry for systems change. This research is organized in 3 studies, placed at these 3 layers of narratives: stories and discourse. I define stories as descriptions of any phenomenon. So this is not just personal stories, but policy paper can be a story, a statistic can be a story. This can be visual, written, or expressed verbally. In the second and central layer, I focus on narratives. I define narratives as dynamic yet stabilized meaning systems that establish a certain way of interpreting the phenomenon around us by weaving together multiple stories. And the third layer focuses on the broader context of organizational discourse where diverse narratives compete for legitimacy. Here it's important to highlight that I'm focusing on organizations and collectives as the space through which this happens. And discourse in a broader sense can also involve what we speak in newspapers or tweets in every space where humans tell stories and express an opinion. So we're focusing on organizations here. As going through all these layers in depth would probably require 2 more PhDs. So the core question is, how might design engage narratives as a sense-making mechanism to foster pluralistic, inclusive, and critical collective inquiry and systems change? I will first ground us in the theoretical background without going too deep. In building this approach, I was in conversation with 4 areas of literature that informed my thinking. These are participatory design, critical futures, science and technology studies, and the feminist SDS as could be thought of a sub-branch of feminist science and technologies. As you can see, my kitty is an avid reader. I'll start with science and technology studies. Science and technology studies study literally how science and technology get made. So science and technology studies argue that science is not just a neutral pursuit of objective truth and progress. Science production is shaped by imaginaries and in turn shapes imaginaries. Imaginaries influence what knowledge we value, the questions we pursue, and which answers are given legitimacy. So the question that informs my research is, how do the social and material contexts of collective sense-making by design shape what imaginaries are given legitimacy? So instead of considering knowledge as this abstract system, I'm looking at how it gets produced in these spaces. Moving on, I was also informed by feminist science and technology studies. Feminist science and technology studies argues that to make room for alternative imaginaries, we need to understand how certain voices, concerns, and possibilities are filtered out in our knowledge system so that we can make room for diverse ways of knowing. So translating this into my research, I explored how we can design spaces of collective sense-making that embrace diverse ways of knowing and also the contradictions to resist the reductive narratives. Participatory design was a big background for me. Participatory design creates alternative space of collective sense-making when institutional framing of issues constrain the meaning that we can create. So when these framings flatten diverse perspectives and smooth out tensions, designers can create spaces of collective inquiry that embrace contestation and polyphony. So this contestation and polyphony was the core principles of my inquiry. I explore how can we use narratives to cultivate these in collective sense-making. And lastly, I was informed by critical future studies. Critical future studies explore how various futures are constructed, contested, or rendered invisible to foster debate about current issues, aspirations, and controversies. The field critiques the dominant narratives that perpetuate exclusionary visions and seeks to give agency to those whose voices are marginalized. So I explore how can design make room for radical possibilities that are obscured by dominant narratives by creating these spaces of collective inquiry. I will move on to methodology now. I'll have a spot water. So you can have a breathe too. I explored this question in the broader context of food system, as you might have gathered from all the food references. This is an image of me working at local food farm, trying to learn the difference between milk thistle and dandelion. This could be any context, but food systems offers a particularly fertile ground for what we're trying to learn here. This is mainly because food is so central to our lives. The issues in our food systems tie together many other issues that concern our collective lives, such as social justice, economy, sustainability, but they also speak to how we relate to food, how we relate to each other, to the land, and other species. Through the controversies in the food system, we can see the different imaginaries at play and also how much is at stake. But this choice was also motivated by personal reasons. It's about the culture shock that I had when I first came to the US and opened my first packaged sourdough bread. And equally, my constant struggle with food as someone who suffers from IBS. So I kind of knew, literally deep down, that something is very wrong with our food system. This research is structured around 3 methods of inquiry. I used ethnography, critical discourse analysis, and action research. These observations helped me the first one is ethnography. So I conducted online and in-person participant observations of local food organizations across Chicago, including conferences, summits, or going and volunteering in different places. These observations helped me navigate the contextual complexities of food system transformation in Chicago, revealing the deep entanglements with racial, gender, and religious identities, including my own. I literally went on one day on Google and typed, "Are Turkish people white?" because this is the place where I got to know my racial identity. Most importantly, these encounters allow me to build relationships with diverse networks of growers, advocates, and policymakers, some of us are honored by joining us here, helping me show up as an ally. The next method that I use is critical discourse analysis. So critical discourse analysis is not a specific method, but rather an approach for unpacking the debate around an issue, to surface the diverse voices and controversies that surround the debate. So the core idea is to understand how the discourse might sustain the status quo, but also be able to disrupt it. So I conducted an initial critical discourse analysis of food insecurity debate in Chicago, and this analysis informed 2 streams of inquiry towards the action research, where I actually implemented these learnings and started testing the emerging ideas out. We did some exploration in the Design for Climate Leadership course at the Institute of Design. In the second part, I focused more on social and material contexts of collective inquiry. So I did an experiment at the Chicago Food Justice Summit. And the second intervention this informed was a 2-year-long action research in a research network that I'm part of with my advisor, Veslin, working on wasted food. The findings from these studies were synthesized into 3 articles that I will discuss in more detail in the second part of this presentation. The articles focus on the 3 overlapping levels of collective sense-making. Together, they propose a broader understanding of how narratives function as a mechanism of sense-making across these various scales of collective inquiry. So in this synthesis, narratives serve as the core layer, and moving up, I explore the discursive layer, where different narratives are constructed and negotiated in the broader context of organizational debates. Moving down, I explore a storytelling approach to disrupt dominant narratives and foster alternative imaginaries. Let's start with the first study at the narrative layer of this research. This one is titled "The Uncommon Good, Making Room for Radical Transition Imaginaries." So I'll first start by what I mean by uncommon good. As we discussed earlier, in multi-stakeholder collaborations, a shared vision is often seen as the North Star of collective impact. But this North Star, that's often framed around high-level goals such as sustainability, equity, or a better economy, can be very misleading. Because stakeholder groups don't necessarily envision the same thing by these high-level goals. And when we don't account for these different visions, we might end up with a superficial alignment where we think we're talking about the same thing, while in there we actually don't. And this ends up causing more friction and trouble as we move forward in our collaboration. But what's worse is that if we don't question what these goals actually mean, we might risk reinforcing the dominant meaning that sustains oppressive and extractive systems that legitimize themselves with claims of sustainability and equity. I developed this approach in an earlier study where I used critical discourse analysis of food insecurity debate in Chicago context. So in this research, I explored why food insecurity matters to different stakeholders and where it fits in their broader future vision. In this analysis, I experimented with a visual approach for comparing diverse aspirations of stakeholders to the core areas of transformation. Based on this experiment, I'm not going to get into the detail of this, I created a set of tools that offer a kind of lighter and more accessible way for designers to replicate this process and use narratives to unpack a systemic issue. So the toolkit consists of 3 stages. First, we utilize stakeholders' narratives to unpack diverse interpretations of common good that shape their transition imaginaries. Second, we use this to surface the different mindsets, values, and worldviews beneath the overarching transition goals, right? Like what we mean by equity, what do we mean by sustainability, and what values are these driven by? In the third stage, we try to contend with the tensions among these to foster a more inclusive and generative transition debate. So we use this tool in the Design for Climate Leadership course at ID. In spring 2023, we collaborated with an emerging initiative for tackling the issue of wasted food in Chicago. This initiative gathered stakeholders from public policy, food service, food waste recycling, and community organizations. So food waste is a very interesting context for seeing how we sometimes live in different worlds that are just a few blocks apart. 450,000 tons of food are wasted in Chicago every year. Yet in 1 in 5 families in Chicago area are struggling to get food on the table on a regular basis. So with this stark contrast, we can see how wasted food is kind of the symptom of deeper problems in our food system. Searching for a shared path to tackle wasted food means grappling with these deeper issues. So we use stakeholder narratives to get a peek at the issue from their different angles and to see the broader significance of wasted food. In the first step of the class, the students analyzed the public narratives of stakeholders to understand why wasted food matters to them. For each stakeholder group, they identified core pieces of their vision on the vertical side and analyzed how different goals of food waste prevention fit into their broader mission. For instance, for a stakeholder that envisions a food system that values local food community, food waste prevention can be a path to empower these communities to build a food system that they aspire to, as opposed to just creating awareness and informing them. This exercise helped us see what goals they focus on, but also what they actually mean by those different goals. This landed us on 3 imaginaries that approach the issue of food system, from different mindsets and value systems. So we had sustainable cities that focus more on sustainable and green infrastructures, and strong and sustainable food industry that emphasizes more green business practices, such as lowering the carbon footprint of food businesses. But we also had community-led food justice, which proposes a more radical transformation of food system to build social equity and economic justice. These imaginaries helped us position wasted food as a shared concern between different visions of a better food system. Imaginaries don't mean much by themselves. They gain meaning in relation to one another. So our next step was looking at the issue from the perspective of these different imaginaries and mapping out where they align and where they create tension with one another. We use this template to facilitate our class discussions. Around the circle, we have different dimensions of systems change, such as culture, skills, knowledge, data, and technology. And we use these categories to consider diverse drivers of systems change to think beyond technological fixes. So for each dimension, we looked at the core commitments, the current issues, and the envisioned future and the proposed changes in between. And moving between these layers, we identified critical shifts that need to be negotiated between these. For instance, when we looked at preventing food waste as a cultural transition, we landed on a deeper question that concerns whether we treat food as a commodity in our culture or a shared resource. After identifying these tensions and shifts between the imaginaries, the next step was to reintroduce them back into the conversation so that they can inform our approach. We created a deck of cards that showed these shifts and showed them in the final brainstorming session we had with the stakeholders. As they discussed opportunity areas and challenges, we asked them to refer to these cards and pick the ones that they find most relevant. This was a way to invite non-dominant approaches into the conversation, but also creating space for that tension to exist in an open-ended way without rushing to reconcile our views. This helped us expand our vision beyond the dominant framing of food waste around optimization and awareness. But it was also hard to break some of the thought patterns that underlie our thinking because they're so deeply internalized. And this is how imaginaries function. They're just there. So we had initially framed an approach for institutionalizing food waste prevention mindsets, thinking this is the way to scale things. We institutionalize them and it stabilizes. This received pushback from food rescue and mutual aid organizations, saying that it is reinforcing the power asymmetries between the institutions that hold access to resources and community organizations. So this got us to shift our approach to consider more networked and decentralized solutions grounded in the existing community-led infrastructures. The core idea of this was to hold space for these different ways of thinking about how food systems can and should be organized. In order to envision our collective lives beyond the dominant mindsets and worldviews, we need to disrupt the narratives that sustain these mindsets. This idea is not new to design. Designers and researchers have built an extensive repertoire for storytelling to counter dominant narratives and offer alternative ones. We can find such narrative resistance in various social movements as well, where activists creatively use performances, humor, art, different vocabularies that subvert the dominant narratives to reclaim their own story. But to reach wide and lasting impact, narrative resistance needs to be fostered as a network capacity. Brett Davidson, who is a narrative change specialist, says that we need to shift the underlying system of stories that help people make sense of the world before we can shift the narrative. This is a core aspect of design practice, right? As we discussed before, in staging the conditions, the spaces, the interfaces through which people make sense of the world, we shape what stories can be told and which ones are left out. A lot of people do that in very creative ways. But if you work with project partners, you might have encountered this moment where all the creative stories we create get boiled down to a set of bullet points. Bullet points are everywhere, just like databases, policy papers, or geographic maps. These create a shared language for finding our way through the complexity of change. But it also feels impossible to express vital aspects of transforming systems such as care, empathy, or relationship with other species under the hegemony of bullet points. As feminist scholar Joanna Bonner states, the things we make are extensions of our ways of knowing. So I argue that in order to cultivate other ways of being, we need to hold space for other ways of knowing that cannot be expressed in a world of bullet points. In order to create meaningful resistance, narrative agency of design needs to be understood within this larger web of stories, and equally the narrative infrastructures that sustain them. We define these as the social and material structures that organize collective articulation of issues, such as artifacts, networks, platforms, protocols, norms, and languages that help us stabilize a certain way of telling the stories of system and help build shared narratives. Narrative infrastructures have the potential to narrow down how we tell stories, but also they have the potential to disrupt it. I frame narrative infrastructures using these 4 dimensions of knowings, meanings, organizings, and doings. I explore how narrative infrastructures activate specific ways of knowing that are acknowledged or legitimized in the broader discourse, their ways of stabilizing or countering meaning, the governance of collectives and discourse, and the material arrangement and practices through which this happens. To understand these dynamics, I conducted 2 stories. First, we seek to understand how narrative infrastructures by design enable and constrain specific ways of knowing, seeing, and dreaming. In the second study, we approach this as a design problem, exploring how might we design narrative infrastructures to diversify the story systems and make room for wider ways of seeing and knowing systems change. The second study of this research is titled Cultivating Narrative Resistance in Systemic Design. Looking at the discourse on the issue of food insecurity in Chicago, I explored how narrative infrastructures shape collective articulation of issues. My goal was to understand how these infrastructures, by design, enable and constrain specific ways of knowing and imagining systems change. Transforming the food system, as we saw many times now, involves a battle over the meaning of food in our collective lives. And this is particularly visible in Chicago context. Despite the city's thriving food economy, many communities, particularly in Black, Brown, and Latinx neighborhoods, remain food insecure due to historic disinvestment and racism. I feel this very strongly when I go visit Iram and Lakeview in our PhD boot camps and come back to Humboldt Park. So it's a whole different food world. In response, communities are building food systems that go just beyond feeding people and demonstrate a world of caring relations between people and the land. This below image is from a community potluck in the Greater Englewood community's urban garden. I looked at how these different meanings find expression in the collective articulation of food insecurity. I sampled discussions from 16 organizations across different sectors and looked at how they articulate the issue of food insecurity across these levels. The analysis revealed 3 narrative territories that characterize shared ways of knowing and framing the issue, and as well as distinct social material environments through which collectives exchange knowledge and advocate for shared pathways. So we have the public policy space, which focuses on shared data flows and agendas. So this is a territory where we see geographic maps, policy papers, task forces. We have the industry space, that's a little bit more narrow, understandably, which focuses more on solution opportunities, often voiced by experts. And this is where we see things like pitch decks, strategic reports, expert talks. And down below, we have community organizations that focus not only on the future of food system, but also the meaning of food as it relates to our identities and histories. This is where we see more diverse modes of expression, such as zines, murals, placemaking, town halls that don't fit into these dominant structures. What's interesting is that across this landscape, as we moved from the space of local communities to more institutional spaces of discourse, the narrative infrastructures increasingly favor expressions that are abstracted, standardized, quantified, or rationalized, right? This is the place where we move from this world of zines to the world of policy reports. Along this spectrum, grassroots organizations have to navigate a delicate balance. They need to claim legitimacy within the dominant frameworks while also countering them. In the food sovereignty movement, we see narrative resistance come to life through the creative use of spaces, artifacts, and language, which open up broader ways of knowing and organizing around food. I'll share an example of this from the Inner City Muslim Action Network. This is an example of mapping as resistance. The map compares the satellite views of two neighborhoods of Lakeview, which, as you may know, a predominantly white and affluent area, and Englewood, a predominantly black and brown neighborhood, often labeled as a food desert. The map highlights, it's kind of hard to see with the slide map. The map highlights Englewood's vacant lots and abandoned buildings, emphasizing the historic disinvestment and racism that created this picture. By doing so, the map pushes back against the term food desert, which implies a natural condition, and advocates for food appetite, a system created by intentional and systemic neglect. Food appetite is an example of vocabularies of resistance in food sovereignty movement. Other examples use metaphors and symbols to convey other ways of knowing and relating to food. For instance, Three Sisters is an indigenous tradition of planting corn, beans, and squash together so that they nurture one another with nutrients. Three Sisters serves as a metaphor for the values of collaboration and reciprocal care that guide food sovereignty movement. So if you think about it, it's a stark contrast with the standardized and neutral language that we're used to seeing in institutional discourse. And this has consequences for the ideas that we can express. We envision narrative resistance in design as a critical engagement with the existing story systems that inform the design process, accounting for the languages through which we express things, and tactical creation of narrative infrastructures that can foster a more diverse story system, inclusive of broader ways of seeing, knowing, and being. I propose a critical compass for cultivating narrative resistance in systemic design based on these dimensions. I ask how we might activate ways of knowing that get suppressed in knowledge systems. How can we intentionally use language, whether textual, visual, or performative, to genuinely create space for alternative meanings and value systems? How can we position our narrative practices within existing networks and channels to enhance coalitions' ability to drive narrative change? And how can we creatively disrupt the narrative traditions that are embedded in the very tools and processes that we use as designers in how we create sense-making spaces? This is not an exhaustive list. This is intended as a guide that can be adapted and reflected on. Very on time.
9:50.
Preach, Azra.
But go ahead. we started a little late. Go ahead.
Take your time.
6 years of research.
Exactly. It's your time.
So in the next and final study, I explore how this can be translated into practice by designing narrative infrastructures. See, I even trimmed one story. In this final part, we're going to zoom into the story systems. So far, we've seen how narrative infrastructures can limit which stories can be told, and this can result in locking institutions into a narrow framing of issues and approaches. This final study looks at how we can design narrative infrastructures to foster more diverse story systems and make room for radical possibilities that get erased in institutional narratives. This was a 2-year project within an NSF-funded research network called Recipes. Recipes brings together researchers from across United States and across different institutions to tackle the issue of wasted food with scientific approaches. I joined the network in 2022 through my advisor, Bethany Ashton. We touched on the issue of wasted food in the first study and its cultural, economic, and political dimensions within the food system. However, in the scientific discourse, these dimensions often tend to get overlooked. The scientific discourse favors solutions that are more focused on supply chain optimization and consumer behavior shifts. I explored a storytelling approach to counter this dominant framing by inviting the personal perspectives of researchers that get excluded from scientific discourse. So between 2022 to 2024, I collaborated with designers in the network on 2 projects. These projects invited network members to explore what makes a waste-free food future through their own perspectives, experiences, stories, values, and frustrations. So as opposed to the objective and abstracted narrative of wasted food that's prevalent in scientific discourse, the goal was to make room for subjective views and the contradictions that get erased from this space. So I'll first share both projects and then talk about what we discovered in these. These projects are my favorite. These are the ones that I had most fun with. The first project is Artifacts of Annoyance. So we created this interactive exhibit during the in-person convening of the Recipes Network. This exhibit displayed a collection of artifacts that exemplify practices in the food system that we as designers and researchers personally felt really annoyed about. So each artifact was paired with a piece of critical history that shows the historical evolution of this practice and its implications. So for instance, one displayed featured items that are typically found in food banks, such as Spam or Kappa soup box, questioning the adequacy of these food items, but also critiquing how food banks became a permanent fixture in a wasteful food system while they were intended as a temporary emergency solution. So our goal was to prompt critical reflection on these normalized practices as a gateway to explore alternative approaches. In the second project, the Collective Pantry, I invited network members to think about what ingredients go into creating a waste-free food future. So the goal here was to use personal stories to foreground cultural and social considerations that tend to get overlooked in dominant framing of wasted food. So we're trying to use stories to collect what gets treated as scraps in academia. This project also started with personal stories. I staged a self-guided storytelling activity during the in-person convening of the network and asked participants to share their personal experience with wasted food. I asked them to reflect on their own story and identify the ingredients this story contains for creating a waste-free food future. I'll be honest, it was very hard to get people to do this, to share their stories. But later on, this took a very interesting turn. Through their stories, participants identified very interesting ingredients like learning with family, seeing food as sacred, or kids' excitement that may or may not seem directly relevant to food and waste. After this activity, I created a website that displayed these ingredients in a virtual pantry, along with the origin story of each ingredient. So from this categorization, we found topics like mindsets and culture, people and relationships, play and creativity, things that don't really make it to scientific discourse. So my goal was to use this platform to bring these considerations back into the conversation. I organized a virtual and network-wide workshop where I invited members to use the ingredients from the pantry to imagine recipes for creating impact for a waste-free food system. As they did that, we also invited them to add secret ingredients that they bring to their table, which could be their research expertise, but also the broader contributions that they might make outside of their formal research role. Our goal in this was to blur the lines between personal and professional spheres and explore how these intersections might enrich collective visions for a waste-free food system. From this process, we can see that as opposed to the dominant framing of scientific discourse, we created an emerging narrative infrastructure that invited new stories to connect and grow in relation to one another. So in doing so, as opposed to the objective and universal narratives of scientific discourse, we foregrounded straighted and partial perspectives, as opposed to reconciliation and cohesion that usually drives institutional discourse. We encouraged contestation and fragmentation. And as opposed to a more linear narrative arc from the problem to solution, space like a pantry or exhibits kind of enabled a more non-linear form of sharing stories. And as we did that, new areas of concern started to emerge from the sharing of stories. And from these new areas of concern, people could, oh my God, I'm totally missing my notes here, so I'm bringing it. As people explored these unusual combinations, they started getting at new ways of thinking about wasted food. So my favorite example was this one group that explored how kids' excitement might be combined with food law awareness. So by exploring this weird combination, they got to think about food law awareness from a more emotional perspective. So they were thinking about kids' reluctance to try new foods unless it comes from someone that they trust. And this combination got them to think about companies' fears of liability in this way, and they came up with an approach that emphasizes networks of trust between organizations to encourage them to adopt these new practices and build that confidence. So this fragmentation and unusual combinations helped inform new approaches that kind of go beyond the dominant framing of wasted food. But what I want to emphasize is that it is not just creating an alternative story system that can be contrasted with the dominant, right? In order for these conversations to create impact, we need to navigate the space in between. And as we try to do that, we encountered many implicit and invisible boundaries that are embedded in the knowledge work. The barriers between our personal and professional spheres of experience, the barriers between institutions and people, or even the cultural norms and barriers that we have, that researchers had deeply ingrained in their heads, that kind of drew this line between cultural approaches and social ones, as opposed to structural and policy-driven interventions. And these barriers are very, very significant for what futures we can envision and which ones we just leave out. So to wrap up, I'll talk about the summary of contributions that came from this research. The first one is expanding the theory of design. By drawing from feminist and scientific technology, science and technology scholarship, I challenged notions such as objectivity, universality, or progress-driven narratives that drive science and policy discourse, constraining what stories can be told and what future possibilities we can envision. So this means that we need to start thinking about sense-making in a different way, to go beyond an idea of sense-making that is like collecting the pieces of a jigsaw and creating this coherent meaning, but connecting these threads of different meaning and stories, working through the knots of these contradictions and tending to the gaps in between. This also translated into a practical approach that can be used in design practice. The framework of narrative infrastructures is intended to serve as a compass to guide designers and other change practitioners in leveraging their narrative agency to amplify alternative possibilities. Narrative infrastructures can be used in an analytical way. to look around and analyze the narrative infrastructures that surround your practice, whether you're in conversation with policy, whether you're in conversation with other companies or communities. This analysis can help really translate the impact of the stories that you create so that they can grow into broader story systems. It can be used in a critical way to examine the tools and processes that we use in the design practice and their implications for the story systems that we can create. And lastly, we can use narrative infrastructures in a generative way, as exemplified in the last story, in ways that can support fragmented views, tensions, and open-ended questions, while also drawing on the past as a valuable source of knowledge. To close, I want to highlight that narratives shape our inner worlds as well as the broader systems in which we live our work. So too must our resistance. Thank you.
Can you say more about the resistance of people sharing the narrative? Like, I can just imagine resistance in working with narrative, like it's not worth our time, and you mentioned that with one of your activities as well. Can you talk about how you engaged people?
Engaging people
There was the sharing of the personal stories. I think it was the collective pantry.
Yeah, so what we tried to get to in the collective pantry was kind of disrupting this systemic filtering of concerns and possibilities that comes from scientific narrative conventions. So to tell it in a maybe more casual way, after I got into the network, I was kind of shocked by how little conversation is happening around cultural and social considerations of wasted food that I was more so exposed to in my personal practice, in my engagement with different communities around Chicago. And I wasn't the only one sharing this concern. So we gathered together and thought that, okay, maybe it's this constraints of scientific expression of things that limit what researchers can express in this space. Because in the one-on-one conversations, we could see that people indeed have these concerns. They just didn't have the space to express it. So storytelling and the collective pantry around it kind of created this scaffolding on which people can grow and attach stories. And as these stories started growing to one another, we built another scaffolding that adapted to that. So it was kind of this process of stewarding the story system, in which, just like gardening, you plant something, it grows, and then you build a scaffolding around it, and then it grows. And this was how it was happening. And I think it's important that we not only tell stories, but build these scaffoldings that can help them grow and expand beyond the immediate domain of conversation. Because if you think about it, stories have only impact as long as they're told, right? Once it becomes a PDF buried deep down in the web, it doesn't really do much. So this process of long-term engagement with the community, building trust with them, aligning this activity with their expectations for their research as individual researchers and as a network was kind of core to this process of stewarding the story system. Yeah, thank you for asking that. Anna, did that answer?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Other questions, comments?
So you talked about decentering dominant narratives, and which I assume has to relate to experiences. So how did you approach trying to get those differentiated experiences as part of this work, or like advice for designers on how to be intentional about centering those different experiences and perspectives?
Yeah, I think I don't know if it exactly answers the question, but we try to integrate some of these into our work at the Food Systems Action Lab, kind of creating these little frictions with the tools through which we tell systems in our work. So I was always protesting this tradition of circles and arrows that gives this sense of coherence and all explaining truth in how we talk about systems. Circles and arrows are great for certain things. I drew many circles and arrows in this process, but they can only tell so much. And I think part of it is acknowledging what we leave out in expressing the systems in the tools and languages that we use, and kind of maybe creating just this micro friction. So in Veslin's class in the second semester, students started adding a layer into this poster. Their poster is just talking about the tensions that might emerge from this process. And that, to me, was like a moment of victory, that they actually did that without even being asked to it, so they opted for that rather than giving this clean narrative of design delivering yet another solution and bright explanation to everything. No, that was how we tried to translate that.
I really appreciate how in a lot of your work you use illustration and all these different alternative tools to tell stories and bring things together. I'm curious what it was like writing a paper and putting together PowerPoint, trying to consolidate what you're emphasizing, which is resisting ways of creation while also producing something that is very specific to academia. What was that navigation like?
Yeah, so Ray was reviewing one of my papers, the second one, and then she very aptly remarked my use of bullet points in the paper while I'm trying to criticize bullet points. And yeah, it's like a constant tension, and even like in coming to this space here together, it's like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna start with a poem. Like I don't know if it's allowed, but narrative resistance, yeah. And then like I'm gonna make these little fun brochures and like tell my research in a really funky, playful, visual language. But it's kind of there are only so many places where I can actually do that. But there are feminist scholars who do disrupt scientific narratives and like formats like journal publication as well. But it is still emerging at the margins, I'd say.
Anybody wants to share your personal stories or comments and with Azra from your experience of working with her on any given moment? It's the moment.
I have to say those flashcards you made with the tensions on them, I still use them and look at them once a week, so good job.
Can you say more about that?
They're just so useful. They're just such a useful way to remember and reframe and rethink about the work that I do. So, yeah.
What is the work that you do?
I'm a food waste researcher. Yeah. Yeah, I love them. I shared them with everyone.
I just want to know, did the internet tell you if you were white or not?
Complicated. Yeah, it did tell me that I'm Caucasian, but I also always tell that I'm Middle Eastern.
Laura and Wesley, do you want to put a closure?
Sure. Well, I do have one comment that I would like you to share. How do you see this work being used by others? So you've given us a couple examples, like through the class. Thanks, Amy, for sharing, how she's using it. So where does this live on after the PhD?
Yeah, so I think there are different ways in which this can adapt it. Some of it can be more at the micro level of frictions with the narrative infrastructures in which we operate, as we talk, like challenging the norms of the tools that we use, challenging the spaces in which we operate and tell stories. But I also think this can inform an emerging practice in design that is more narrative informed and that fosters narrative change. So to set a broader picture, narrative change work is picking up in policy, is picking up in social sector, and people are now like noticing that, where was my quote? Okay, I cannot find it. There are too many slides. But people are now noticing that it's not just about telling different stories, but about cultivating this as a networked capacity. And as design becomes more and more active in the spaces of collective inquiry and collective sense-making, I think there is a new role for us to foster narrative change in those spaces, but also really being in conversation with those fields that have a broader expertise in these to understand these dynamics and how we can take advantage of them or shift them in design practice. That's what I'd say. Yeah, there is a feature there.
Yeah, I would love to make a contribution to the discussion. I'm just so proud of the work that you've done, and I think one of the things that your presentation and dissertation shows is the ways in which ID has been able to integrate, knowledge from design and science and technology studies into an approach. And it's very evident in the writing style, in the voice that you use in the presentation, and it also balances really nicely between the rigor and the analytical position, but also, where you use poetry, you also gave examples from lived experience, your own and or the participants in the workshop. So I think it's really a very interesting moment to see how that's happened over the last 5 to 8 years, I guess. So I guess my question will be, at the risk of, we have a couple of hours to discuss after this, so I don't want to necessarily use up all my good questions. But I think
share with the public the best questions.
Yeah.
The boring ones we can take into the room.
Yeah, I would say along those lines, it follows up from Chris's question, I think, because I think in design, with the models and methods, we tend to present at sometimes a very 30,000 foot view or 10,000 foot view of the project and the contributions. And so I would love to know, to integrate two questions. One is, and you don't necessarily have to answer them, but the space I'm really interested in would be, how did you change as a person as a result of this research, whether that be personally, professionally, or intellectually? How did you change by engaging with this field site, these people, the people that came to the workshops and the neighborhoods you're able to, study and participate in? And then, what would be a story about one particular person from the field site, whether it be an activist or someone who is gardening or someone who lived in a neighborhood or someone that was part of the NSF grant? What is one story from that person's life which shows a meaningful relationship or change in thinking? So that's kind of what I'd be interested in.
Yeah, I really appreciate you asking that, and I want to highlight here that Laura was my primary advisor for my first 2.5 years of my research. So she was the one who instilled a lot of these dangerous thoughts in my head. And she was also the one that helped me.
Powerful.
she also helped me unlearn a lot of things in a very patient way. So I consider that to be very important in the PhD journey. I think it's equally about unlearning as it is about learning. So I came from hardcore industrial design education with a Master of Science. So my view of the world was like you as researcher as separate from the thing that you observe, and you need to represent things as objectively as possible, only rely on the data and all of this dominant scientific thinking. And it took a lot of times to keep noticing these things, these entrenched ways of thinking in my head, and really disrupting them bit by bit. So as we're like doing this funky illustrations over the past week with Iram, we're like, why didn't we get to this state earlier? Because it was like at some point something got unlocked, and I was like, I don't have to obey these things. I can actually like paint out of the lines, and that was a very long and slow process. That's why I insist that like narratives shape our inner worlds as well. So it's not just about shaping what's external to us, but noticing what's inside and transforming that as well. So like for me to put in my bio that I'm a designer, researcher, and a visual artist was a big moment of actually bringing those identities together. And yeah, when we did the collective pantry, I was illustrating, I was sketching, and that really created a different language that can connect people, and that gets people excited because they have those feelings, they have those aspirations that's just waiting to be expressed in the right medium. I'm thinking about, the second question, story with someone. I think one, like, I can't put it in a specific story. I think it's a set of stories. Is the person who leads our mutual aid group in Humboldt Park Solidarity Network. His name is Nick, and he is this most dedicated and caring person who will always be there for his neighbors and extremely resilient. So like every once in a while we drop by the store, I do the weekly grocery runs for our mutual aid groups, and every once in a while he drops these stories of the things that he witnessed in the neighborhoods and they're not all like cute and fuzzy experiences, but just like seeing how he keeps going on despite everything and opens those doors and he's there for the neighbors. As I think like a big source of inspiration for me among other people, like Bill, you as well. Because there was a moment in the research where we went to Netherlands for a presentation, and I got exposed to all of this like more transition policy debate. I came to a point of thinking, what transition am I even talking about? Like looking at all the things that are happening in the world, I'm like, is this even? Are you just like entertaining yourself and others, or like is this a real thing? But it was, I think, like these encounters that kept me going and really like made me value these other worlds that are in the making around us that get obscured by those big stories. Thank you for asking that.
Maria wants to make a comment.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm just really so happy for you to see your growth, and I feel extremely fortunate to be part of your journey. Hands down, best thesis I had witnessed at IIT. And I'll try to break down why. Incredibly wide range of reference in the construction of the state of the art. Way outside of your comfort zone, which is really unusual when you're doing a thesis. People tend to stay within the reference that they know to build a state of the art. Therefore, we end up with a state of the art that is rather biased. Valid, but biased. In your case, the state of the art includes contradictions or contradictory points of view, which gives a particular density to the hypothesis. That was extraordinary to read. Then a sort of case studies that are not tied to a geographical location, but rather to where ideas come from and what ideas that particular group of people might have, which implies that we might share across cultures and locations a set of principles when it comes down to food justice. So you set the methodology already with different principles. That happens rarely because it's really difficult to handle those case studies. And you did it, I was part of one of them, with making people feel at ease. But then, documenting the results and with such rigorosity. Don't see it all the time, Azra, for real. And then what you're saying is, look, what you can do to move towards justice, whether it's food or anything else, is to create spaces for impossibles to encounter, to find each other. Because when these two impossible things meet, then you have a window of opportunity to create something you didn't know before. And that has a chance at addressing problems outside of comfort zones like your theoretical framework that aims to set a set of new principles like your case studies for different kinds of constituencies like the ones that participate in your research. The level of coherence from page 1 to the end is ridiculous. And you add to that that it's beautifully written and beautifully presented. Let's just get to work. I don't have questions. I have propositions for you to join the free open research and work that I've been trying to hunt Wesley for. But I think we got a team here. we got the Secretary of Agriculture in front of us. That will be a good world. Congrats.
Thank you.
No question. I have no question. I have propositions. I'm real. That's it. Just let's go work in Bronzeville and Inglewood. We got things to do.
But I think your point really highlights like how this work is so relational, and I think that's something that we need to keep remembering at ID, that it's not just about putting posters out there and like doing pitch presentations, but like building these relations and working through them. I think that was the most important thing that I learned in Recipes Network, because it was very uncomfortable to like make a funky experiment with like 50 senior researchers, like professors, chemists, like all of these other natural science disciplines that I'm not really familiar with. But that happened thanks to the relations that build that trust and comfort. I think we need to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Azra. I think I can speak for all of the folks in this room who have been a part of your research, your journey, that this work has significantly influenced how we think. I think your ability to connect with people, right? These these stories help to connect with people. Like we've talked about, like a whole person as a way of really approaching this work, right? So as someone who's trained in kind of more of the scientific method and approach, it has been incredibly insightful for me to work with you over these last few years, and that work is extending, right? So not only within the university, so here at ID, the ability for you to work with our students and share these methods and to develop them, as well as our partners from outside. And Amy, I'm just, so excited that you're using this, like some of Azra's work, because, we do want to see that the work that we do here does not sit in the university, that it does have real world impact, and it has an ability to shape how designers work, how professionals work, and I think you've done that in this journey. So thank you. Thank you for the folks in the room, the folks online, for sticking around. We will now move to the second part of the PhD exam. So the committee, Laura, Carlos, Maria, and I will have 2-hour, maybe a little bit less than 2-hour consultation with Azra to ask her hard questions, for her to defend her work. And at 12?
Yes, I think it should.
We plan to have
Social events, some snacks. Yep.
Yeah, where we will present the results of her exam. So congratulations, Azra. Thank you so much.